The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of the local grocery store as Harold Martinez slowly made his way toward the entrance. His weathered hands gripped the handle of his worn shopping cart, each step deliberate and measured. At 73, Harold had learned to take his time with everything. His left leg, injured decades ago in Vietnam, still gave him trouble on cold mornings like this one. Harold had been making this same trip to Patterson's Market every Tuesday for the past 8 years, ever since his wife Elena had passed away. She used to handle all the shopping, chatting with the clerks and neighbors while Harold waited patiently in the car. Now, these weekly excursions had become one of his few remaining connections to the outside world. As he entered the store, Harold nodded politely to the young cashier who barely looked up from her phone. He wasn't offended. At his age, Harold had grown accustomed to being invisible. Young people had their own lives, their own concerns. They didn't have time to notice an old man shuffling through the aisles with his short shopping list. Harold made his way to the produce section, carefully selecting 2 apples, a small bag of potatoes, and some carrots. His appetite wasn't what it used to be, and cooking for one person required a different kind of math than the generous meals Elena used to prepare for their family gatherings. Their 3 children lived in different states now, each absorbed in their own busy lives. They called dutifully every few weeks, but Harold could hear the distraction in their voices, the background noise of grandchildren, and career demands. In the cereal aisle, Harold reached for his usual box of plain oatmeal. His doctor had recommended it for his cholesterol, though Harold suspected it was more about having something routine to look forward to each morning than any real health benefit. As he placed the box in his cart, a young mother with 2 toddlers rushed past him, one child crying loudly about wanting candy. The woman looked frazzled and tired, completely focused on managing her little ones. Harold smiled slightly, remembering when his own children were that age, how Elena would somehow manage to keep them all in line during shopping trips. The memory brought both warmth and a familiar ache. Elena had been gone 8 years now, but the loneliness still caught him off guard sometimes. They had been married 47 years, and Harold still found himself saving up little stories throughout the week to tell her, only to remember she wasn't there to listen. Harold continued through the store methodically. He picked up a small container of milk, some bread that would last him until the next Tuesday, and a can of soup. His entire shopping trip rarely cost more than $25, a stark contrast to the overflowing carts he used to push when the kids were home, and Elena was planning elaborate Sunday dinners. At the checkout, Harold waited patiently behind a businessman who was impatiently tapping his credit card against the reader while talking loudly on his phone about some urgent meeting. The man never acknowledged Harold, never made eye contact, never offered the small courtesies that used to be common between strangers. When it was Harold's turn, he smiled at the teenage cashier and thanked her genuinely for her help. She mumbled something in return, already focused on the next customer. Walking back to his car, Harold reflected on how different the world seemed from when he was young. People moved faster now, always looking at their phones, always rushing somewhere. He remembered coming home from Vietnam in 1971, how overwhelming it had felt to readjust to civilian life after 18 months in the jungle. But, at least then, people still looked at each other, still acknowledged each other's presence. Harold loaded his groceries into the back seat of his old Honda Civic. The car was 15 years old, but still ran well. Elena had always said there was no point in buying something new when what you had still worked perfectly fine. It was one of many practical philosophies she had lived by, wisdom that Harold tried to carry forward in his daily life. As he drove home to his small apartment, Harold passed the elementary school where he used to volunteer reading to children. He had stopped going there 3 years ago when they implemented new background check procedures that seemed designed more to keep volunteers away than to welcome them. The principal had been apologetic but firm about the new policies, and Harold hadn't fought it. At his age, he had learned to pick his battles carefully. His apartment building was a modest 2-story complex that housed mostly retirees and young professionals just starting out. Harold lived on the ground floor, which was easier on his leg. His 1-bedroom unit was clean and organized, decorated with photographs from happier times. Elena smiling in their garden, their children at various ages, Harold in his military uniform looking impossibly young and serious. Harold put away his groceries with the same methodical care he brought to everything these days. The apples went in the small bowl on his counter, the milk in the refrigerator next to yesterday's leftovers that he would probably have for lunch. The routine was comforting, predictable in a way that helped fill the quiet hours. After lunch, Harold settled into his favorite chair with a book about World War II aircraft. Reading had become his primary entertainment, though his eyes weren't as sharp as they used to be. He had fought in a different war, in a different era, but he found comfort in stories of other soldiers, other men who had served their country and then returned home to build quiet, ordinary lives. The afternoon passed slowly. Harold dozed in his chair, waking occasionally to the sound of children playing outside or neighbors coming home from work. Through his window, he could see a young military family that had moved in last month. The husband was often in uniform, clearly active duty, while his wife chased their toddler around the small playground area. Harold had thought about introducing himself, maybe sharing some of his own military experience, but he didn't want to intrude. Young families had enough to worry about without an old veteran bothering them with stories from an unpopular war. That evening, Harold prepared his simple dinner of soup and toast, eating while watching the news. The stories were depressing, full of conflict and division, politicians arguing and experts predicting doom. Harold remembered when news was just information, delivered by serious men in suits who simply told you what had happened without spending 20 minutes arguing about what it meant. Before bed, Harold walked slowly around his apartment, checking the locks and turning off the lights. This had been his routine since Elena died, a security ritual that helped him feel settled for the night. In the bedroom, he looked at her photograph on the nightstand and whispered good night, just as he had every night for 8 years. As he lay in bed, Harold thought about the day ahead. Wednesday would bring a visit to the Veterans Administration Clinic for his regular checkup. He dreaded these appointments, not because of any health concerns, but because of the crowds and confusion, the long waits and uncomfortable chairs surrounded by other old men who looked as lost as he felt. Harold had served his country with honor during one of its most difficult periods. He had done his duty, come home, raised a family, worked hard for 40 years, and paid his taxes. He had voted in every election, volunteered in his community, and tried to be a good citizen and neighbor. But now, in the final chapters of his life, he often felt like a relic from a forgotten era, invisible to a world that had moved on without him. The next morning arrived with the same familiar routine. Harold woke early, as he had every day since his military service, and prepared his simple breakfast of oatmeal and coffee. He read the newspaper carefully, though the stories often left him feeling disconnected from modern life. The world seemed to be changing so rapidly that he sometimes felt like an observer watching a movie about a place he used to know. Harold dressed carefully for his medical appointment, wearing the same navy blue slacks and white shirt he wore to all his formal occasions. Elena used to lay out his clothes the night before important appointments, making sure everything was clean and pressed. Now Harold managed these details himself, though he sometimes missed a stain or forgot to iron a collar properly. The drive to the VA clinic took him through parts of the city he rarely visited anymore. New buildings had sprung up where he remembered empty lots or old businesses. Chain restaurants and big box stores had replaced the small family-owned shops where he and Elena used to browse on weekend afternoons. Progress, he supposed, though it didn't feel like improvement to him. Harold found the changes unsettling not because they were necessarily bad, but because they served as constant reminders of how much time had passed, how much of the world he had known was disappearing. Even the people looked different somehow, younger and more hurried, always staring at devices instead of paying attention to their surroundings. At the clinic, Harold joined the familiar crowd of elderly veterans waiting for their appointments. Some came with adult children who helped manage their paperwork and medications. Others, like Harold, sat alone, quietly patient in the way that military training had taught them to be. The waiting room conversations were subdued, mostly about health problems and family news, occasionally touching on shared memories of service that created brief moments of connection between strangers. When Harold's name was called, he followed a young nurse down a hallway lined with motivational posters and information about veteran benefits. The nurse was kind and professional, asking about his medications and any changes in his condition since his last visit. Harold appreciated her patience with his slow responses and careful way of describing symptoms. The doctor, a woman young enough to be his granddaughter, was thorough and respectful. She listened carefully to his concerns about his leg pain and asked detailed questions about his sleep and appetite. Harold found himself opening up more than usual, perhaps because her genuine attention was something he rarely experienced anymore. She increased one of his medications and recommended some physical therapy exercises he could do at home. As Harold left the clinic, he felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that his health problems were manageable, sadness that this monthly medical appointment had become one of the few times when someone paid careful attention to him, when his words and concerns mattered to another human being. 2 weeks after his medical appointment, Harold decided to break from his usual routine. Instead of staying home on Thursday afternoon, he drove to the nearby shopping center to pick up a prescription that his regular pharmacy didn't have in stock. The larger pharmacy was located in a busy strip mall that Harold rarely visited, surrounded by restaurants and stores that catered to younger customers. As Harold parked his Honda and slowly made his way toward the pharmacy, he noticed how different this place felt from his quiet neighborhood. Families with small children hurried between stores, teenagers gathered around the entrance to a gaming store, and business people grabbed quick lunches from the food court. The energy was overwhelming after the peaceful solitude of his apartment. Inside the pharmacy, Harold waited in line behind a young woman arguing with the pharmacist about her insurance coverage. Her voice was sharp with frustration as she explained that she needed the medication for her child and couldn't afford the full price. Harold listened sympathetically, remembering the financial struggles he and Elena had faced when their children were young, and medical bills seemed to multiply overnight. When it was his turn, Harold handed over his prescription and insurance card with a polite smile. The pharmacist, a middle-aged man who seemed frazzled from dealing with the previous customer, processed Harold's order efficiently, but without much conversation. Harold didn't mind the lack of small talk. He understood that everyone was busy, but he couldn't help noticing how different customer service felt compared to the old days when pharmacists knew their customers by name. With his prescription in hand, Harold decided to walk through the shopping center rather than return directly to his car. His leg was feeling better today, and the mild exercise might do him some good. As he strolled past the various stores, Harold observed the life happening around him with the careful attention of someone who had learned to find interest in small details. Outside a coffee shop, a group of college students sat around a table covered with textbooks and laptops, their conversation animated as they debated some academic topic. Harold paused nearby, pretending to look at a store window while listening to their discussion about history and politics. Their perspectives were different from his own, shaped by different experiences and different times, but Harold appreciated their passion and engagement with ideas. An elderly woman with a walker emerged from the coffee shop, struggling to balance her cup while managing her mobility aid. Without thinking, Harold stepped forward and gently offered to help carry her drink to a nearby bench. The woman accepted gratefully, and they sat together for a few minutes while she rested. Her name was Dorothy, and she lived in an assisted living facility a few blocks away. This weekly trip to the coffee shop was her main outing, a small adventure that helped her feel connected to the larger world. As they talked, Harold learned that Dorothy had been widowed for 12 years and had no children nearby. Her situation was remarkably similar to his own, though her physical limitations were more severe. Dorothy told Harold about her late husband, who had been a teacher for 35 years before retiring. They had traveled extensively during their retirement, visiting places they had dreamed about during their working years. Her eyes lit up as she described trips to Europe and national parks, adventures that had given meaning to their later years before illness forced them to slow down. Harold shared some of his own memories with Dorothy, talking about Elena and their quiet life together. He found himself opening up in a way he hadn't done with anyone in months, encouraged by Dorothy's genuine interest and understanding. She listened without judgment, nodding sympathetically when he described the loneliness of living alone after so many years of partnership. When Dorothy's ride arrived to take her back to the assisted living facility, she and Harold exchanged phone numbers. It had been years since Harold had made a new friend, and the prospect of having someone to talk with occasionally felt like an unexpected gift. As her van pulled away, Dorothy waved from the window, and Harold felt lighter than he had in weeks. Walking back to his car, Harold reflected on how much the brief conversation had meant to him. He realized how starved he had become for genuine human connection, for the simple pleasure of being heard and understood by another person. The encounter reminded him that loneliness wasn't unique to his situation, that many people were struggling with similar feelings of isolation. That evening, Harold called his daughter Maria in Phoenix. Their conversations usually focused on practical matters, her work schedule, and the kids' activities, but tonight Harold found himself telling her about meeting Dorothy. Maria seemed surprised but pleased to hear her father talking about making a new friend. She encouraged him to stay in touch with Dorothy and even suggested that he might consider looking into other social activities for seniors. Harold had always been reluctant to join organized groups, preferring the independence of managing his own schedule and activities. But Maria's suggestion made him think about possibilities he hadn't considered. Maybe there were other people like Dorothy, other widowed seniors who might appreciate companionship and conversation. Over the next few days, Harold found himself thinking about his conversation with Dorothy and his daughter's encouragement to be more social. He looked through the community newsletter that arrived monthly in his mailbox, something he usually threw away without reading. To his surprise, there were several activities listed that might be appropriate for someone his age and interests. The local library hosted a monthly book discussion group for seniors. A nearby community center offered coffee and conversation sessions twice a week. The Veterans of Foreign Wars Post had regular meetings and social events. Harold had known about these opportunities vaguely, but he had never seriously considered participating. Harold's military experience had taught him the value of careful planning and reconnaissance before taking action. He decided to drive by these various locations during his regular errands, observing the people who attended and getting a feel for whether he might fit in. The library seemed welcoming and quiet, the community center busy but friendly, the VFW familiar in its military atmosphere. A week later, Harold worked up the courage to attend the library book discussion. The group was small, about 8 people ranging in age from their 60s to their 80s. They were discussing a novel about World War II, a topic that Harold knew something about from his own reading and his father's stories from that earlier war. Harold sat quietly for most of the session, listening to the other participants share their thoughts and reactions to the book. The discussion was thoughtful and respectful, with people building on each other's ideas rather than arguing or trying to dominate the conversation. When the librarian asked if he had any thoughts to share, Harold offered a few observations about the historical accuracy of some military details in the novel. His comments were well received, and several group members approached him after the session to continue the conversation. An older man named Frank mentioned that his brother had served in Vietnam, and they talked briefly about their different experiences of that era. A retired teacher named Margaret recommended several other books she thought Harold might enjoy. As Harold drove home from the library, he realized that he had enjoyed the intellectual stimulation of discussing ideas with other people. He had forgotten how good it felt to contribute to a conversation, to share knowledge, and learn from others' perspectives. Elena had always been his primary companion for this kind of exchange, and he hadn't realized how much he missed it. The next Tuesday, Harold's routine shopping trip felt different somehow. Instead of moving through the store with his usual focused efficiency, he found himself more aware of the other customers, more inclined to make small talk with the cashier. The young woman seemed surprised but pleased when Harold asked about her studies, and she mentioned that she was working her way through community college while living with her grandmother. Harold shared that his wife had also worked while going to school, back when such things were less common for women. The brief conversation created a small connection that made both of them smile, a reminder that generations separated by decades could still find common ground in shared human experiences. That evening, Harold called Dorothy to check on how she was doing. She was delighted to hear from him and shared news about her week, including a visit from her niece and a new resident at her facility who had also been a military spouse. Harold told her about the book discussion group and his conversation with the young cashier, small victories in his effort to reconnect with the world around him. Dorothy encouraged Harold's social activities and shared her own observations about the importance of staying engaged with life. She had noticed that the residents who remained curious and connected seemed to age more gracefully than those who withdrew into isolation. Her insight resonated with Harold, who had begun to recognize how his own withdrawal had accelerated after Elena's death. As spring approached, Harold's world gradually expanded beyond his small apartment and routine errands. He became a regular at the library book discussions, contributing more confidently to conversations and developing casual friendships with several other members. He visited Dorothy weekly, sometimes bringing her favorite magazines or sitting with her in the facility's garden when the weather was nice. Harold also began taking longer walks around his neighborhood, partly for exercise but also to observe the changes and activities in his community. He discovered a small park he had never noticed before, where he often saw the same dog walkers and joggers following their own routines. These brief encounters with neighbors gradually became more familiar, progressing from polite nods to brief conversations about the weather or local news. One afternoon, while reading on a bench in the park, Harold was approached by the young military family from his apartment complex. The husband introduced himself as Sergeant First Class Michael Rodriguez, recently assigned to the nearby base. His wife, Carmen, was pushing their 2-year-old daughter on a swing while trying to manage their energetic 4-year-old son. Harold and Michael struck up a conversation about military service, discovering that they had both spent time in challenging deployments, though in different decades and different conflicts. Michael was respectful and genuinely interested in Harold's experiences in Vietnam, asking thoughtful questions about how different the military had been in the 1970s. Carmen joined their conversation when the children needed a break from playing. She mentioned how difficult it had been to adjust to their new assignment, leaving family and friends behind to start over in an unfamiliar place. Harold empathized with their situation, remembering his own family's moves during his military career and the challenges Elena had faced establishing new connections in each location. As their conversation in the park continued, Harold found himself drawn to the Rodriguez family's warmth and openness. Michael and Carmen were clearly devoted parents, working together to manage their active children while maintaining the kind of partnership that reminded Harold of his early years with Elena. Their 4-year-old son, Diego, was curious about everything, asking endless questions about the playground equipment and the birds he spotted in nearby trees. Harold offered to watch the children for a few minutes while Michael and Carmen discussed some logistics about their upcoming move to base housing. He found himself enjoying Diego's chatter about his favorite toys and his excitement about starting kindergarten soon. The boy's enthusiasm was infectious, and Harold realized how much he had missed the energy and wonder that children brought to everyday experiences. When Carmen mentioned that they were still learning about the local area and looking for family-friendly activities, Harold surprised himself by offering to share some recommendations. He told them about the library programs, the nearby hiking trails that Elena had loved, and the community center activities that might interest their family. Carmen seemed genuinely grateful for the local knowledge, and Michael mentioned that they would love to continue their conversation sometime. As the families parted ways that afternoon, Harold felt energized by the interaction in a way he hadn't experienced in years. There was something about being useful to young people, about having knowledge and experience that could benefit others, that reminded him of his value beyond his own immediate needs. The feeling stayed with him through the evening and into the next day. Harold began to notice Michael in uniform more frequently, usually in the early mornings when both men were starting their days. They developed a habit of brief conversations in the parking lot, Michael heading off to the base while Harold prepared for his various errands and appointments. These exchanges were comfortable and respectful, built on their shared military background, but extending into discussions about family, community, and the challenges of different life stages. Michael mentioned that his unit was preparing for a deployment later in the year, a reality that would mean separation from his young family for many months. Harold listened with the understanding that only comes from personal experience, remembering his own deployments and the strain they had placed on his relationship with Elena and their children. He found himself offering perspective and encouragement without being preachy or assuming that his experiences directly translated to Michael's situation. During one of these conversations, Michael asked Harold about adjusting to civilian life after military service. It was a topic that Harold had rarely discussed with anyone, partly because his transition had been complicated by the unpopular nature of the Vietnam War, and partly because he had learned to keep his military experiences private. But Michael's genuine interest and his own upcoming challenges with deployment and family separation created space for Harold to share insights he had never articulated before. Harold talked about the importance of maintaining connections with family during deployment, about finding purpose and structure in civilian life that provided some of the satisfaction that military service had offered. He shared practical advice about staying emotionally present with children even when physically absent, lessons he had learned sometimes through mistakes during his own parenting years. These conversations with Michael began to change how Harold thought about his own experience and knowledge. He realized that his decades of life, including both his military service and his years as a husband, father, and working civilian, had given him insights that might be valuable to younger people facing similar challenges. The recognition didn't make him feel proud exactly, but it did make him feel relevant in a way he had forgotten was possible. Harold also found himself thinking more about his military service in positive terms. For years, he had focused on the difficulties of that time, the challenges of serving in an unpopular war and returning to a country that wasn't particularly interested in hearing about his experiences. But talking with Michael reminded Harold of the good aspects of his service, the friendships he had formed, the skills he had developed, and the sense of purpose that had shaped his character. One morning, Harold noticed that Michael seemed more serious than usual during their brief parking lot conversation. When Harold asked if everything was okay, Michael explained that his deployment date had been moved up, and he would be leaving in just 2 weeks instead of the originally planned 2 months. The compressed timeline was creating stress for the entire family, particularly Carmen, who was now facing the prospect of managing 2 young children alone in a relatively unfamiliar place. Harold found himself offering practical help without really thinking about the implications. He mentioned that he was usually home during the day and would be happy to assist Carmen if she needed anything while Michael was deployed. He could help with errands that were difficult to manage with small children, provide emergency backup if one of the kids got sick, or simply be available as a familiar face in the community. Michael seemed genuinely moved by Harold's offer. He explained that their extended family was scattered across different states, and Carmen's parents were dealing with their own health issues that limited their ability to provide support. Having a trustworthy neighbor who understood military life could make a significant difference in Carmen's ability to manage the deployment successfully. Over the next few days, Harold, Michael, and Carmen worked out practical arrangements for mutual support during the deployment. Harold would check in with Carmen weekly, be available for emergency situations, and help with tasks that required an extra adult presence. In return, Carmen offered to include Harold in family dinners occasionally, and to let him help with simple maintenance tasks around their apartment that would give him a sense of usefulness. These arrangements felt natural and comfortable to all parties involved. Harold appreciated having specific ways to help that didn't feel like charity or intrusion, while Michael and Carmen were relieved to have local support from someone they trusted and respected. The plans also gave Harold something to look forward to, a sense of responsibility and purpose that had been missing from his routine for several years. As Michael's departure date approached, Harold found himself thinking more about the impact that military deployments had on families. His own children had been older during most of his service, and Elena had been an experienced military spouse who managed their household with remarkable competence. But he remembered the loneliness and worry that deployment brought to military families, even under the best circumstances. Harold decided to reach out to the local VFW post that he had been considering joining. When he called to inquire about membership and activities, he learned that they had several programs designed to support deployed service members and their families. The post organized care packages, maintained communication with deployed units, and provided assistance to military spouses dealing with the challenges of single parenting during deployment. The conversation with the VFW representative opened up possibilities that Harold hadn't considered. He could contribute to these support programs in ways that utilized both his military background and his current availability. The post needed volunteers to help organize events, assist with practical support for military families, and maintain connections with younger veterans who might benefit from mentorship and guidance. Harold arranged to visit the VFW post the following week, curious about how he might contribute to their mission. The building was familiar in its military atmosphere, decorated with flags and memorabilia from different eras of American military service. The members he met ranged from World War II veterans in their 90s to recent Iraq and Afghanistan veterans in their 30s and 40s. The diversity of ages and experiences represented at the post reminded Harold that military service created bonds that transcended generational differences. The older veterans shared stories and wisdom with younger members, while the recent veterans brought energy and new perspectives to traditional activities. Harold found himself welcomed into conversations and activities with an ease that surprised him. During his visit, Harold learned about a mentoring program that paired older veterans with younger military families facing deployment or other challenges. The program was designed to provide practical support and emotional guidance based on shared understanding of military life and its unique stressors. Harold realized that his relationship with the Rodriguez family was exactly the kind of connection that the program was designed to foster. Harold signed up to become a formal mentor through the VFW program, which provided him with training and resources for supporting military families effectively. The training covered topics like recognizing signs of stress in military spouses and children, understanding current military policies and benefits, and maintaining appropriate boundaries while providing meaningful support. The week before Michael's deployment, Harold invited the Rodriguez family to dinner at his apartment. He prepared one of Elena's favorite recipes, a simple but hearty meal that had always been popular with their own children and grandchildren. The evening was relaxed and enjoyable, with Diego entertaining everyone with his stories about preschool, while baby Maria charmed the adults with her developing vocabulary. After dinner, Michael and Harold talked privately, while Carmen helped Diego with a coloring book. Michael expressed his gratitude for Harold's friendship and support, mentioning how much it meant to have someone locally who understood both military life and the challenges of raising a family. He also shared his own concerns about the deployment, his worry about Carmen managing alone, and his fear of missing important moments in his children's development. Harold listened with the patience and understanding that comes from having faced similar challenges. He assured Michael that Carmen was clearly capable and strong, that the children would adjust to the temporary changes, and that the deployment experience, while difficult, could ultimately strengthen family bonds when handled thoughtfully. His words carried weight because they came from someone who had lived through these experiences successfully. Harold also shared practical advice about staying connected with family during deployment, including suggestions for regular communication schedules, ways to remain involved in daily family decisions, and strategies for making the most of leave time when Michael could return home. These were lessons Harold had learned through his own deployment experiences and through observing other military families over the years. The evening ended with plans for Harold to drive the family to the base for Michael's departure ceremony. Carmen mentioned that having Harold present would provide emotional support for her, while also giving Diego and Maria a sense of continuity and community support during the difficult goodbye. Harold was honored to be included in such an important family moment. On the morning of Michael's departure, Harold arrived early to help load the family's luggage and to provide whatever support Carmen might need. Diego was excited about visiting the base and seeing his father's workplace, while Maria seemed to sense the emotional weight of the occasion without understanding its full implications. The base was busy with deployment activities, families saying goodbye, and military units preparing for their missions. Harold observed the scene with the dual perspective of someone who had both participated in such departures as a service member and witnessed them as a family member. The emotions were familiar but still powerful, a mixture of pride, worry, love, and determination that defined military family experiences. The deployment ceremony took place in a large hangar filled with families, military personnel, and community supporters. Harold stood quietly beside Carmen, holding baby Maria while Diego clung to his mother's hand, overwhelmed by the crowds and formal atmosphere. The ceremony itself was dignified and moving, with speeches about service and sacrifice that reminded Harold of his own military experiences and the importance of the mission these young men and women were undertaking. When the time came for final goodbyes, Harold stepped back to give the Rodriguez family privacy for their personal farewells. He watched Michael embrace Carmen and his children with the intensity of someone trying to memorize every detail of the moment. Diego cried when he realized his father was really leaving, while baby Maria reached for Michael with confused distress. Harold found himself deeply moved by the scene, remembering his own deployments and the pain of leaving Elena and their children behind. The emotions were universal among military families, transcending the decades between his own service and Michael's current deployment. When Michael approached Harold to say goodbye, the young sergeant's gratitude was evident as he thanked Harold for his friendship and support. The drive home from the base was quiet, with Carmen focused on comforting her children while processing her own emotions about the deployment. Harold understood the need for silence and reflection, remembering how overwhelming the first day of deployment separation could be for military families. He helped carry the children's bags upstairs and offered to stay for a while if Carmen needed company, but she chose to spend the rest of the day privately with Diego and Maria. Over the following days, Harold established a routine of checking in with Carmen regularly without being intrusive. He would stop by briefly in the mornings to see if she needed anything and call in the evenings to make sure the family was settling into their new schedule. Carmen appreciated the consistent support, particularly during the challenging bedtime routines when Diego would ask repeatedly when his father was coming home. Harold found that his role as a supportive neighbor gave him a sense of purpose that had been missing from his daily life for years. Instead of simply managing his own routine and appointments, he now had responsibilities that connected him to a family's well-being and success. The change was subtle but significant, transforming his daily activities from mere survival to meaningful contribution. Through his involvement with the Rodriguez family, Harold also became more active in the VFW mentoring program. He attended monthly meetings where mentors shared experiences and strategies for supporting deployed military families. The program connected Harold with other veterans who were working to bridge the gap between generations of military service members, creating networks of support that strengthened entire military communities. Harold learned that many military families struggled with isolation during deployments, particularly when they were stationed far from extended family support systems. His own experience with loneliness after Elena's death gave him insight into the emotional challenges that military spouses faced during long separations. The recognition created common ground that helped Harold connect more effectively with the families he was assigned to support. 3 weeks after Michael's deployment began, Harold received an emergency call from Carmen. Diego had developed a high fever during the night, and Carmen was worried about taking both children to the emergency room alone. Harold immediately offered to accompany them, providing the additional adult presence that would make the hospital visit more manageable for everyone involved. At the emergency room, Harold helped entertain baby Maria while Carmen focused on Diego's medical needs. The fever turned out to be caused by a common childhood virus that required monitoring, but no serious treatment. However, the experience reinforced for both Harold and Carmen the value of having reliable local support during family crises when the deployed parent was unavailable. The incident also demonstrated to Harold how much his own confidence and competence had grown through his involvement with the Rodriguez family. He had handled the emergency situation calmly and effectively, drawing on decades of experience with family challenges and medical concerns. The realization reminded him that age and experience could be assets rather than limitations when applied to helping others. As autumn progressed, Harold's weekly routine expanded to include regular activities with Carmen and her children. He often joined them for weekend trips to the park, helped Carmen with grocery shopping when managing 2 children became overwhelming, and provided evening childcare occasionally when Carmen needed to attend mandatory military spouse events or handle personal business. These activities brought unexpected joy to Harold's life, reminding him of the satisfaction he had found in being a father and grandfather. Diego's endless questions about military history led to conversations about Harold's own service, shared through age-appropriate stories that emphasized honor, friendship, and service to country rather than the darker aspects of combat experience. Harold also found himself communicating regularly with Michael through video calls that included the entire family. These conversations allowed Michael to stay connected with his children's daily activities while also maintaining his friendship with Harold. Michael appreciated Harold's perspective on family developments and his ability to provide reassurance about Carmen's well-being and the children's adjustment to deployment life. During one of these family video calls, Diego proudly showed his father a drawing he had made of Harold in military uniform. The 4-year-old's artwork depicted Harold as a heroic figure, complete with medals and an American flag background. Michael was clearly moved by his son's obvious affection for Harold, commenting that Diego had found a positive male role model to help fill the gap during deployment separation. The drawing incident made Harold reflect on the unexpected ways his life had expanded through his relationship with the Rodriguez family. He had started as a lonely widower going through the motions of daily survival, but his involvement with military family support had reconnected him with purpose and community in ways he hadn't anticipated when he first offered to help Carmen during Michael's deployment. Harold's transformation was gradual but unmistakable. Friends from the library book discussion group commented on his increased energy and engagement during their meetings. Dorothy noticed his improved mood during their weekly visits, and even the pharmacy staff remarked on his friendlier demeanor during routine errands. The changes reflected Harold's renewed sense of connection to life and community. As winter approached, Harold began planning ways to help Carmen and the children through the holiday season without Michael. He researched military family support programs that provided holiday assistance, organized volunteers from the VFW post to help with decorating and gift preparation, and coordinated with Carmen's extended family to ensure meaningful holiday traditions could continue despite Michael's absence. The holiday planning process introduced Harold to other military families dealing with deployment separations during important family celebrations. He discovered a network of military spouses who supported each other through shared experiences and practical assistance. Harold's involvement in this community provided him with additional opportunities to contribute his time and experience to helping families succeed during challenging circumstances. Harold also began participating in the VFW Post's letter-writing program, which sent regular correspondence to deployed military units around the world. Writing these letters reminded Harold of his own deployment experiences and the importance of maintaining connections with home and community while serving overseas. The activity provided another way for Harold to contribute to military welfare while honoring his own service experience. On Thanksgiving Day, Harold joined the Rodriguez family for dinner, contributing Elena's traditional cornbread stuffing recipe to their celebration. The day was bittersweet, marked by Michael's absence, but also by gratitude for the family connections they were maintaining despite the separation. Diego said grace before dinner, including thanks for Harold's friendship and Michael's safe service, words that moved Harold deeply. After Thanksgiving, Harold received a letter from Michael expressing gratitude for Harold's support during the deployment and sharing news about his unit's mission and activities. Michael mentioned that knowing his family had reliable local support allowed him to focus on his military duties without constant worry about Carmen's ability to manage emergencies or daily challenges alone. The letter also included Michael's observation that Harold seemed to have found new energy and purpose through his involvement with military family support. Michael credited Harold with setting an example of how veterans could continue serving their country and communities through civilian activities that honored their military experience while addressing current community needs. As the year drew to a close, Harold reflected on the remarkable changes in his life since his chance meeting with the Rodriguez family in the park. His daily routine now included multiple meaningful relationships, regular volunteer activities, and a sense of purpose that extended far beyond his personal needs and survival. The transformation had begun with simple kindness, but had grown into a comprehensive re-engagement with life and community. Harold realized that his military service, his decades of marriage and parenting, and even his experience with loss and loneliness had all contributed to his ability to support other military families effectively. The recognition didn't erase the sadness of Elena's absence or the challenges of aging, but it provided context that made his current life feel meaningful rather than merely endurable. On New Year's Eve, Harold attended a VFW Post celebration that honored both deployed service members and the community volunteers who supported military families during deployments. Harold received recognition for his outstanding service as a military family mentor, an honor that surprised him with its emotional impact. Standing before a room full of veterans and military families, Harold felt a sense of pride and belonging that had been absent from his life for many years. In his brief acceptance speech, Harold thanked the VFW post for providing opportunities for older veterans to remain connected to military service and community welfare. He spoke about the privilege of supporting young military families and learning from their experiences while sharing the wisdom that comes from decades of life experience. Harold concluded by noting that serving others had given him a sense of purpose that honored both his military service and his civilian life. After the ceremony, Carmen approached Harold with tears in her eyes, thanking him for the support he had provided during the most challenging months of her life. She mentioned that Harold had become like a grandfather to her children and a trusted friend to her family, relationships that would continue long after Michael returned from deployment. As Harold drove home from the New Year's celebration, he thought about the unexpected journey that had brought him from isolation to community involvement, from survival to service, from loneliness to meaningful relationships. The changes in his life had begun with small steps, brief conversations, and simple offers of help, but they had accumulated into a transformation that surprised him with its depth and significance. Harold understood that his story wasn't unique among older veterans and military families. Many people his age were struggling with similar challenges of loneliness, irrelevance, and loss of purpose after retirement and the death of spouses. Similarly, many military families were dealing with the stresses of deployment and community isolation without adequate local support systems. The realization that individual connections could address multiple community needs simultaneously gave Harold hope for the future and motivation to continue expanding his involvement in veteran and military family support activities. His own transformation from invisible old man to valued community member demonstrated the potential for positive change even in the later stages of life, when many people assume that meaningful growth and contribution are no longer possible.